From New York, this is ABC News. Now, Harry Reisner.
Good evening. It turns out today, according to the morning after statements, that practically everybody won in the New Hampshire primary. Candidates who placed from first through fourth all explained they had done at least as well and probably better than they expected. It took until morning for the Republican results to be firm, a very narrow 51 to 49% victory for President Ford over Ronald Reagan. The White House said the president was delighted. ABC White House correspondent Tom Gerald has a report.
When President Ford went to bed at 11:30, he was facing a morning of defeat, but when he flicked on the radio this morning, he found himself a winner. Based on that razor-thin margin, the Ford political people today began predicting he'll win enough primaries to go to the GOP National Convention as a first ballot nominee. With such a close contest, the president cautiously set out the day and didn't appear before cameras to comment on New Hampshire until a late afternoon appearance before the small-town newspaper representatives of the Inland Daily Press Association.
It's not my birthday today, but I did get a fairly good present in the last 24 hours. So with those...
President, as a keen political analyst, would you care to comment on the results of the Democratic primary in New Hampshire?
Looks like a horse race to me.
He reflected on Reagan's second-place finish.
Some of those who didn't do so well yesterday seem to be satisfied with second. I never knew of any political campaign where running second was very beneficial.
Reagan apparently is still enough of a threat to qualify for some serious political jabs. A Ford spokesman says Reagan gave his maximum effort and couldn't win, and Reagan has ducked out of primaries where he couldn't do well. Tom Gerald, ABC News in Washington.
Ronald Reagan had never predicted victory, although some of his supporters had sweet dreams of defeating an incumbent president. There were times last night when it looked as if the dreams might come true. But advisors had said 40% of the vote would satisfy them, so 49% was just fine. Frank Reynolds has a report on Governor Reagan.
Precisely at the stroke of midnight, Reagan appeared in his Concord headquarters. At that point, he still had a narrow lead over President Ford. However, though he knew the gap was being closed, he insisted that whatever the final tally, he had been successful.
If it continues the way it is, we, of course, have far exceeded our expectations.
After a few hours' sleep, Reagan awoke to the news that Mr. Ford had overtaken him. However, that did not change his assessment of what had happened.
I think you have to win some primaries, sure. But I think here in this state, as I said before, we came in here with the intention of trying to make a good showing. And this is, as I say, far better than anything that we had anticipated or that we came here to do. A virtual tie with an incumbent president, including some write-in votes on the Democratic side, I think is enough to send us away very happy.
So Bo Calloway says they whipped you in one of your best states.
Oh, Bo Calloway. You know something? Sometimes I think I'm running against Bo Calloway.
Regardless of how the results are analyzed, a loss is still a loss. And obviously, Reagan would rather have finished first here. Still, he almost did. And he believes that a challenger who comes so close has more to cheer about than an incumbent who barely ekes out a victory. Reagan moves on now to Illinois and later tonight to Florida, confident that he got from New Hampshire all that he needed, if not quite everything he wanted. This is Frank Reynolds, ABC News, Manchester, New Hampshire.
New Hampshire's Republican voters gave President Ford 17 delegates to the National Convention. In spite of the closeness of the preferential primary, Reagan received only 4 delegates. Governor Reagan issued a statement on his personal finances today. The statement said he's worth an estimated $1,455,000. Reagan's financial statement shows he made about $282,000 last year, twice what he made in 1974 when he was governor of California. The sources of Reagan's income were not listed in the financial statement.
Also tonight, Sam Donaldson, Charles Gibson, and Don Farmer on the Democrats, Ted Koppel on the Nixon controversy, and Stephen Gear on the Judge and the Hearst trial.
Jimmy Carter, the former governor of Georgia, went into the New Hampshire Democratic primary expecting to win. With 30% of the vote, Carter did what he expected to do, coming in 6% ahead of his nearest rival, Morris Udall. ABC's Sam Donaldson is traveling with the Carter campaign and has this report.
The winner's smile is always a little brighter. The victory chant from the happy workers always a little louder. And Jimmy Carter told his supporters what they wanted to hear. That he now thinks the convention will produce a nominee on the first ballot. But Carter's opponents are nowhere near ready to concede that he will be the nominee. A chance meeting last night with Senator Bayh demonstrated that.
Well, see you in Massachusetts.
I'll be there.
All right, good job.
Carter lost no time carrying his campaign to Massachusetts this morning. His assessment has been that he already had a sure third place here, but after New Hampshire, he now hopes to do even better in the Bay State. At a Boston news conference, Carter talked about his campaign.
I have 7 of my family members here, large numbers of volunteers. We don't have much money to spend in Massachusetts. I have to be frank about that. on a financial basis, we're running a very minor campaign. But we have an enormous amount of momentum now for us. And one of the reasons that the voters have turned to me in New Hampshire is because they don't like to be put in little boxes. Democrats in this country are looking for someone not to divide them up into little tiny compartments, but to bind us together in a homogeneous group of Americans who can correct the deficiencies in our government, break down the veil that separated us from our government in Washington, and let us work together toward a common purpose.
Carter's task now is to demonstrate that he can broaden his support. His win was impressive, but after all, almost 7 out of 10 Democrats in New Hampshire voted for someone else yesterday. And he must also demonstrate that he can stand up under the intense scrutiny we'll now be subjected to. His days of relative obscurity are ending. And people who never heard of Jimmy Carter before last night will want to know whether there's more to him than a determined manner and a winning smile. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, Boston.
Before yesterday's primary, Morris Udall was hoping for a second-place finish. His 24% did put him second among all Democrats and well ahead of the rest of the liberal group. Technically, Udall lost, but Charles Gibson reports it's all in how you look at the returns.
Such are the numbers games of politics that Morris Udall could claim victory in New Hampshire without winning. He beat the other liberals in the race, and the key for him, he beat third-place finisher Birch Bayh worse than Jimmy Carter beat him. So now, Udall's task is twofold. Continue to stay ahead of the other liberals, but begin running against Jimmy Carter as well. Thus, Udall made his first move against Carter today.
But take the busing question, for example. Jimmy Carter said on Issues and Answers, and I was 6 feet away from him and heard him, he said he is against anything but voluntary busing. Now, you're going to get about as much voluntary busing out of South Boston, if it comes down to that, as you're going to get voluntary friendship for the Israelis from the PLO. And what you're really saying, if you take that position, is to every black and every Chicano and every minority in America, I'm all for you and I love integration, but if it comes down to a crunch, and we're going to have the courts ordering the Constitution to be enforced, I'm not with you.
As he set out campaigning again, Mo Udall began by mixing metaphors. It's a new ball game in Massachusetts, and we're playing with a full deck, he said. By that he means not only are all the liberals in the race again, but this time Carter's got opposition in the more moderate wing of the party, from Jackson, Wallace, and Schaap. So the Udall strategy becomes beat the other liberals again here in Massachusetts, force some of them out of the race, then get their support. All of that while keeping Jimmy Carter within sight. It may sound like a long shot, but Mo Udall was a lot longer shot when he started. Charles Gibson, ABC News, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
New Hampshire's Democrats will send 17 delegates to the National Convention. Of those, 13 were won yesterday by Jimmy Carter and 4 by Morris Udall. During the New Hampshire campaign, Senator Birch Bayh said he would be satisfied with a third-place finish. The problem Bayh faced was to become more generally recognized. With 16% of the New Hampshire vote, Bayh is still facing the same problem. Don Farmer reports on his campaign.
Birch Bayh moved his campaign into Massachusetts after leaving his New Hampshire supporters with the message that they and he had done well there. Bayh started early in Boston this day at a Federal Reserve building construction site, spreading the word to the Bayh believers here that in New Hampshire he simply had to survive. In Massachusetts, he must move ahead strongly. His audiences were hard hats and senior citizens, but the message was the same. The forward economic policy, the Federal Reserve money policy in particular, is hurting, not helping the people. But there was time for the inevitable post-mortem about New Hampshire and its significance to the primary here.
I thought we could run third in New Hampshire, and we did. And we did exceptionally well, I think, in 4 months compared to what the other candidates had tried to do in over a year. And I think that's the only fair test to put on it. I think we're going to be stronger here, and I think we'll be even stronger in New York.
So Bai has survived New Hampshire, and now he has a week to do what must be done here in Massachusetts. Here, Bai must catch up with or pass Morris Udall. If he does not, the momentum he needs for that all-important New York primary a month later will be lost. This is Don Farmer, ABC News, with the Bai campaign in Boston.
Fourth place in the Democratic primary went to former Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris, who got 11% of the vote. Harris was hoping to finish third, but he was largely ignored by the New Hampshire Democratic Party. In last place among the major Democratic candidates was Sergeant Shriver. Shriver says he's encouraged with his 9%, and he's looking forward to a better showing next week in his home state of Massachusetts. Several candidates who were not on the ballot received write-in votes. Hubert Humphrey got 6%. Senator Henry Jackson got 1%, and Senator Edward Kennedy's name was written in by just over 200 voters, a fraction of 1%. The anti-abortion candidate, Ellen McCormick, got 1% of New Hampshire votes yesterday. Today, the Federal Election Commission ruled that she is now eligible for matching campaign funds. Mrs. McCormick will receive her first check for $100,000 before Sunday. Former President Nixon has ended his visit to Peking and is moving south to the city of Guilin as an honored guest of the Chinese government. Mr. Nixon's China trip continues to arouse criticism and controversy in the United States. The strongest criticism yet came today from fellow Republican, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. We have reports, first from Ken Kashiwahara in Peking.
It was a day of China's ancient and her contemporary for the Nixons. At the Museum of Natural History, the Nixons were shown relics of a Chinese civilization 6,000 years old, including the famous Peking Man. Mr. Nixon seemed interested in all the history before him, and at some points expounded on his own theories of anthropology. The highlight of the tour was a look at China's most recent archaeological find, the life-size figures of warriors and horses carved during the Qin dynasty more than 2,000 years ago. That over with, the Nixons plunged into the China of today. The crowds in the vast Tiananmen Square obviously knew who they were. The Nixons' pictures had been prominently displayed in Peking newspapers. The scene was not unlike a Nixon campaign of years past. Crowds pushing and shoving just to shake his hand. The former president seeking out the children and engaging in small talk through his interpreter. So whatever they choose, huh?
Whatever work the party needs him to do.
The Chinese, of course, don't have election campaigns, but with Mr. Nixon's Pied Piper-like magnetism in China's most famous square, it seemed likely that he might pick up a few votes here if he were running. The crowning irony of this Nixon campaign is that he had to come 7,000 miles to press the flesh again. This is one of the few places in the world where no one has ever heard of Watergate. Ken Kashiwahara, ABC News, Peking.
This is Ted Koppel in Washington, where Watergate is not an entirely unfamiliar name, and where today on ABC's Good Morning America, Senator Barry Goldwater gave the Nixon China trip one of its unkindest reviews yet.
I don't think Mr. Nixon's visit to China did anything, and if he wants to do this country a favor, he might stay over there. He's violating the law. The Logan Act prohibits any American, and that's all he is. He's an ex-president and a private citizen. The Logan Act says that no one but the President or the Secretary of State can discuss foreign policy. And he made a tremendous mistake in doing what he did at the time he did it. I don't think it hurt Ford. I don't think the average American has enough respect for Mr. Nixon anymore to really believe that what he's doing is in anybody's interest but Mr. Nixon's.
Secretary Kissinger, who hadn't seen the Goldwater statement, wouldn't respond to it directly, so he was asked to comment on the general propriety of Nixon's dealings with the Chinese government.
Well, I don't think that I should be in a position to comment on the private decisions of former President Nixon.
No, I'm really asking you to comment in your role as Secretary of State.
In my role as Secretary of State, we obviously prefer to deal with other governments through official channels.
Mr. Secretary,
if I could just say something, I think Mr. Nixon went there because the Chinese invited him and because he saw it as an opportunity to hurt Mr. Ford in New Hampshire. And I think it's a little ungrateful in view of the fact Mr. Ford pardoned him.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Secretary?
Secretary Kissinger would just as soon have this entire issue disappear. It is most unlikely that Mr. Nixon will actually be prosecuted under the Logan Act. It's been on the books for 177 years, and no one's ever been convicted of violating it yet. But the Nixon trip remains a monumental embarrassment to the administration, and the central problem now is how to find out what Nixon learned without appearing to endorse his role as intermediary. This is Ted Koppel, ABC News, Washington.
President Ford today nominated former Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Scranton succeeds Daniel Moynihan, who will relinquish the job before the end of the month. White House correspondent Ann Compton reports.
As longtime friends, they all posed in the Oval Office. The President, the Secretary of State, and William Scranton, who will fill the vacuum the flamboyant Daniel Patrick Moynihan is leaving. They let it be known that the cast is changing at the UN, but American policies are not.
It will be a very difficult job. I think everybody is aware that the United States is being attacked in the UN a great deal. I'm a Pat Moynihan fan, and I was delighted with the way he handled it. I think we're on the up end in the United Nations, primarily due to the policy of the President and the Secretary and the activity of Ambassador Moynihan, and I'm proud and happy to be his successor.
While Scranton may fill the official ambassador's role, his low-key nature will never match Moynihan's controversial style. Scranton is known not for his foreign policy credentials, but his loyalty to the Ford team, which Scranton helped organize during the painful hours of transition from the Nixon days. Ann Compton, ABC News, the White House.
2 American diplomats were set free in Beirut today after being kidnapped by Palestinian guerrillas 4 months ago. The United States Embassy said they were in good health and would be returned to the United States almost immediately. The embassy said no ransom had ever been demanded for Charles Gallagher and William Dykes, and no concessions had ever been made on their behalf. In San Francisco, the prosecution in the Patricia Hearst trial attempted today on cross-examination to destroy the credibility of a psychiatrist called by the defense. Stephen Gear reports.
This was not a day of high drama in the Patricia Hearst trial, but rather a day of fascinating glimpses and small amusements. Assistant prosecutor David Bancroft meticulously and earnestly tried to chip away at the great mass of psychiatric testimony by Dr. Lewis West of UCLA, a prisoner of war expert who has told the court that Miss Hearst was a victim of coercive persuasion by the SLA. But Bancroft kept running into dead ends, asking about bits of testimony taken from Dr. West's reports. Dr. West kept saying that's out of context and managed to read entire paragraphs for the jury's benefit, paragraphs favorable to the defense. When defense attorney F. Lee Bailey repeatedly objected to Bancroft's tactics, Bancroft objected to Bailey's objections, and Judge Oliver Carter brought laughter to the courtroom by telling Bancroft, if you're saying he has no right to object, I'll tell you to go soak your head. But the testimony was not entirely favorable to the defendant. The jury learned through cross-examination of Dr. West that Patricia Hearst had tried LSD and mescaline with Stephen Weed, that Weed had grown marijuana hydroponically in their backyard, and that Miss Hearst in school had once told a nun to go to a place where nuns aren't expected to go. Stephen Gear, ABC News, San Francisco.
A House subcommittee today voted to recommend contempt citations against 5 present or former members of the FBI and the National Security Agency for refusing to testify about government interception of cables. The witnesses acted on orders of Attorney General Edward Levy, who claimed executive privilege and national security as justification. The Supreme Court today upheld a California law that prohibits employers from knowingly hiring illegal aliens. The decision was a victory for Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union. The union wanted the law since illegal aliens from Mexico work for less than union wages. The Food and Drug Administration announced today that 3 drug companies have agreed to stop making 3 sequential oral contraceptives. The brands name are Oricon, Orthonovum SQ, and Norglans. The FDA said that studies suggest that the sequentials may increase the risk of cancer. Existing supplies will not be recalled. While the United States debates a welcome to the Concorde airliner, Tokyo has had a brouhaha over its new airport, and Japanese environmentalists have taken extraordinary steps to try to block its development. We have a report from Irv Chapman.
This junior Tokyo tower rises 210 feet in the air, directly in the flight path of the new Tokyo International Airport. The tower and another smaller one were built by opponents of the airport, including local farmers and radical student groups. Today, in hopes the airport can be opened in 1976, the first steps were taken to pull down the towers, behind a protective screen of 1,000 riot policemen. They outnumbered the demonstrators by 4 to 1, but there were clashes nonetheless. Before the day was out, some 33 persons were injured slightly, 11 of them policemen, and 48 were arrested. Workmen moved first to clear away a barrier built by the protesting groups. That's done, work can begin on a road to bring in the equipment needed to demolish the towers. The airport itself, half a mile away, was completed 3 years ago, after long delays as opponents blocked the acquisition of land. These sporadic demonstrations may not cease until Narita Airport is finally open for business, if then. This is Irv Chapman, ABC News, Tokyo.
Stock prices were mixed today in very heavy trading. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained about a point to close at 994.57. Standard & Poor's Index was down 0.34. The American Stock Exchange Index closed up 0.14. A final note, one candidate in the New Hampshire primary did not do as well as he had hoped and said so and explained why. Fred Harris, 4th among the Democrats, said it was because the little people he was aiming at were too short to reach the levers on the voting machines. He's added a plank to his platform, a stool in every voting booth. That's the news. I'm Harry Reisner. Good night.
This has been ABC News with Harry Reisner.